Welcome to In Search of Heaven's Gate, an exploration of the history, beliefs, and practices of the Heaven's Gate movement. This is Episode 6, Going Beyond Human. Throughout this short series, we've primarily sought to gain clarity on what the followers of Heaven's Gate believed would survive after death, what many religious systems call the soul. Heaven's Gate referred to just as often as the mind. We've sought clarity on these and other related concepts in the hopes that doing so would offer insight into what most people probably think of when they hear the words Heaven's Gate. This is, of course, the 39 men and women who brought an end to their lives in late March 1997. And so, in the final installment of this series, I think it's appropriate that we consider the following question. Why was it that in order to go beyond human, the followers of Heaven's Gate believed it was necessary to forfeit their very lives? As we already know, there were a number of requirements that followers of Heaven's Gate believed they needed to fulfill before they could even hope to enter the kingdom of heaven, or as they referred to it, the next level. We can organize these requirements into four basic categories. These are grace, faith, overcoming, and graduation. So far, we've primarily talked about the first three of these necessary steps in the Heaven's Gate belief system. Today, I'll summarize what we've learned so far and explain how these other requirements built up to the fourth and final stage in their efforts to go beyond human. First, an individual needed to be selected by the next level, to be given an opportunity to rise above their human experience. In some religions, such as Christianity, the religion from which Heaven's Gate derived many of their own essential beliefs, this concept is sometimes referred to as election or grace. In Heaven's Gate, election or grace came in the form of what believers called soul deposits. Now, a soul deposit can refer to a couple of different things. It can refer to certain impressions left on a person from past lives, past incarnations, memories that are encoded deep within them. Memories that are triggered when, for instance, someone heard the words of Applewhite and Nettles for the first time. Such a notion was tenable, at least within the context of their belief system, because of their belief in reincarnation. If believers only lived once, then the notion of storing subconscious information from past lives would of course be incoherent. A soul deposit can also refer to the soul itself, or as Heaven's Gate believers often called it, the mind. One of the most intriguing and surprising features of the Heaven's Gate belief system is that on their view, not everyone who is alive is necessarily in possession of a soul. That's because a soul is a mind given to a person by the next level. This is distinct from the belief that while everyone has a soul, only some of these souls are saved, others are not. Ultimately, there's no functional difference between these two ways of looking at it because the result is the same. Since individuals who lack a soul in the Heaven's Gate belief system cannot enter the next level after death, it's very similar to the Christian view that a soul which is not saved does not enter heaven. Being given a soul does not guarantee that a person will continue to seek out the next level for the rest of their lives. They could fall away, they could reject it, but only those who have souls even have the opportunity to grow in faith or not. Thus, for Heaven's Gate believers, the soul is necessary for salvation, but it's not sufficient. We can think of this again as being similar to the concept of grace, because as human beings, we are by nature opposed to the things of the next level. We cannot choose it. We have no desire for the things of this higher realm. Heaven's Gate co-founder Marshall Applewhite had a favorite analogy he liked to use to explain this idea. He said, Think about when a zoologist tags a particular animal for further study. There's something about this animal that interests him or her. They want to be able to check up on it. They select certain animals for further development. But what does it mean to be selected for further development as a human being by the next level? Well, it means that someone will be given a desire to develop themselves beyond being human. Remember that the principal problem is that our nature as human beings is in conflict with the nature of a next level member. An ordinary human does not want for themselves what the next level wants for them. This is why they believed we needed to be given a desire and a drive to seek out those teachings that would change their nature from that of a human being to that of a next level being. And to do this, one would have to seek out a qualified teacher. This brings us to the next stage of their journey beyond human: faith in the teachings of Applewhite and Nettles. According to the Heaven's Gate belief system, an individual who wanted to transcend the human kingdom needed to find and follow the teachings of a living representative from a higher kingdom. In the past, they believed that such figures as Moses, Enoch, and Jesus Christ had fulfilled this role. But then in the mid-70s, two individuals named Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles asserted that they had come to fulfill the same task. The role of a next-level representative was twofold. In the first place, they served as a model for proper conduct, as well as being the liaison between the members of their group and the members of the next level. In the second place, a living representative was necessary for entry into the afterlife, precisely because, from their perspective, entry into heaven was contingent on having a personal guide. Faith in the teachings of Applewhite and Nettles is non-negotiable. Arguably speaking, it is the most essential aspect of life in Heaven's Gate. Everything else that they said and did turned on this belief, that Applewhite and Nettles had come from heaven as they claimed, and that the information they shared with their followers was to be trusted. But even if someone had complete faith in the teachings, it didn't necessarily mean that they practiced them perfectly. Plenty of people can come to believe that they are alcoholic, yet struggle to maintain sobriety. That's because believing you have a problem and want to change is necessary, but not sufficient on its own. Changing these inborn habits takes considerable time and effort. Becoming a next-level member required faith, but it also required practice. And this is why those who came in contact with Applewhite, Nettles, and the rest of their group while they were still alive were then required to undergo a lifelong process of behavioral and cognitive training, which was intended to prepare them for entry into the kingdom of heaven. They termed this process the overcoming. Before an individual could get to the next level, they needed to remove those parts of themselves that still clung to human ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. This was essential because, according to their belief system, the next level did not permit anything that still belonged to the human level of existence. We might compare this requirement to the need to remove metallic objects like belts, jewelry, or gadgets before passing through a metal detector. If we try to get in without removing something, like a pair of keys or a necklace that we forgot we were wearing, it will set the alarm off, and we won't be permitted to pass through. Similarly, in order to enter the next level, one was required to dispose of their human ways. That is, they needed to remove those parts of themselves that would not be permitted in this higher kingdom. To accomplish this end, they engaged in a variety of practices, exercises, and customs that were designed to reform the way that they thought and acted. They observed a number of dietary restrictions, refrained from sex, and avoided drinking alcohol or using drugs. They placed a great deal of emphasis on a person's capacity to follow instructions and on being able to deal with challenges and even disagreements with other group members in a way that was emotionally sober. Flying off the handle, interpreting instructions in your own way, or engaging in worldly pleasures, these were not appropriate ways to conduct oneself. They used a number of techniques to wean themselves off of their desire for sex, their tendency towards anger, and anything else deemed detrimental to spiritual growth. Some of these techniques included prayer and meditation, fasting for periods of time, remaining celibate, as well as various forms of cognitive and behavioral reconditioning. All of these techniques were collectively referred to as the overcoming process because they thought that being human was, ultimately, a state that one needed to overcome, to transcend, to move beyond. They strove to develop an entirely new personality, to cultivate a new set of values, ideas, and emotional responses, all of which they modeled on the way that they imagined a member of the next level would conduct themselves, a way of life that stood in stark contrast to that of a merely human existence. This distinction was not limited to merely spiritual and psychological differences. It also included physiological differences. Eventually, they knew they would need to leave this world behind, including their own bodies. Which brings us to the last stage of their journey beyond human. The fourth and final requirement for the original members of Heaven's Gate was what they referred to as the exit or the graduation, the point at which they were ready to leave their physical bodies behind and go to the next level. For much of the history of this group, there had been an ongoing discussion amongst themselves as to whether or not graduation from the human kingdom to the next level would actually require a literal physical death. In fact, for the first few years, Heaven's Gate members believed that they would be taken up in their bodies, not unlike the biblical figures of Enoch and Elijah. They thought that Applewhite and Nettles would be martyred for their beliefs, and that after 3 days they would rise from the dead, ascend into the heavens, and bring their followers with them. This was the first of several different prophecies that Applewhite and Nettles would espouse. This particular prophecy was known as the demonstration, since they figured it would settle once and for all the question of whether or not they were really who they said they were, emissaries from the kingdom of God with the power to master life and death. However, there was at least one problem with this prophecy. Applewhite and Nettles predicted that their martyrdom and resurrection would occur before the end of the 1970s. Within just a few years, with no martyrdom and no great demonstration, it became obvious that this prophecy had failed. In spite of this, the group never really completely abandoned the possibility that their lives would end at the hands of a powerful authority, such as the government or the police. But their commitment to this idea waxed and waned over the years, coming to the fore at certain points and receding to the back of their minds at others. By the 1980s, they were predicting that a flying saucer would come down to collect them and their followers, transport them to the next level in a spaceship, with their human bodies remaining intact. For this reason, Applewhite and Nettles instituted a practice known as Night Watch. Night Watch was essentially a chore that certain members of the group would be responsible for overseeing. Night Watch, as the name would suggest, primarily consisted of staying awake all night, looking up at the sky, and taking note of anything that appeared out of the ordinary. But after several of these extraction prophecies failed to materialize, along with a number of false alarms during various Night Watch activities, they set aside this hypothesis as well. Then, in 1985, Bonnie Nettles passed away of cancer. She did not ascend to heaven in her human form, nor was she extracted by a spaceship. She simply passed away like any other human. While academics and documentarians alike have somewhat overstated the significance of this event in the construction of the group's later beliefs, it is undeniable that Heaven's Gate believers were forced to re-examine some of their prior assumptions about the way in which they would, eventually, depart from this planet. Nettles was not only their co-founder, she was also the first member of Heaven's Gate to die while in the group. Some have erroneously stated that the death of Bonnie Nettles flung Applewhite and the rest of the group into a deep despair. But recordings produced by the movement in the immediate aftermath of Nettles' passing directly contradict this narrative. The group can be heard joking and laughing and joyously reporting that Nettles' presence could still be felt among them, albeit in a spiritual rather than bodily form. Others have suggested that the death of their co-founder served as the catalyst for the suicides of 1997. This is a bit of a reach, however, and for a number of reasons. First, there is the obvious problem, namely that these two events were separated by more than a decade. If the death of Bonnie Nettles made them want to bring an end to their own lives, why did they wait 12 years to do it? Second, there is the problem of membership. Some of those who were present at the time of the suicides had not even been in the group when Nettles died. They had never even met her. How would her death account for their participation? Finally, the notion that the death of Bonnie Nettles resulted in a nihilistic shift in the group's thinking leaves out the very obvious fact that their philosophy was always a life-denying one. They had always planned to leave this world behind, one way or another. That wasn't something that changed only after she died. Although the precise manner in which they chose to leave changed over the years, the seeds of their final act were planted from the very beginning. But more importantly, this narrative neglects precisely what makes Heaven's Gate such an important religion to study, and that is their unyielding capacity to adapt their teachings in the face of the unexpected. When Bonnie Nettles died, they didn't refer to this event as her death. They referred to it as her re-entry. Within days of her passing, Applewhite reported to his followers that Nettles' spirit would continue to influence the group as they persisted in their work to overcome their humanness. And the followers of Heaven's Gate responded to this report with joy and relief. She did not die from their perspective. She did not leave. In their view, she re-entered the kingdom from which she had come. Her death posed no more problem for their theology than any of the other failed predictions the two had been prophesying for the past decade. They were able to contextualize her death in a way that aligned with their broader belief system. And, for that matter, they were able to do so very quickly after she passed. As such, from the group's point of view, there was no reason to expedite their own exit just because Nettles had died. They still believed they had work to do, and that her spirit would continue to assist them while they went about their tasks. As the 1990s rolled in, events like Ruby Ridge and the Waco siege reawakens their belief that martyrdom at the hands of either the police or the United States government could potentially serve as their ticket off this planet. Far from stoking fear and paranoia, these events led to a kind of envy. The followers of Heaven's Gate were wondering what on earth they would need to do to get the attention of the authorities, to pose enough of a threat to mainstream society that the government would be forced to intervene. This led them to concoct a plan to somehow instigate a shootout between themselves and the authorities. They even purchased a number of firearms in preparation for this convoluted plan. Ultimately, the reason they did not go through with this is because they realized that the likelihood of a shootout resulting in all of their deaths was considerably low. They also considered the possibility that some of them might survive but suffer permanent injuries, and they didn't want that. So they locked up their weapons in a garage and set about a new plan, a plan that would guarantee a quick, relatively painless death, one that all of them could participate in at the same time, in an event that would go down in history. In late March 1997, the 39 members of Heaven's Gate, including their leader Marshall Applewhite, ingested a deadly amount of drugs and suffocated themselves. None of them survived. Why did this happen? Well, for the followers of Heaven's Gate, the fate of their souls was of far greater importance to them than the fate of their bodies. Not only because they believed the soul was eternal, whereas the body was merely temporary, but also because they conceptualized existence in the next level as being free of all the pain and strife experienced by human beings. Death was framed as a positive experience, as a transition from a less evolved and more miserable state of being into a more advanced and more enjoyable one. Collectively speaking, the group felt that they had all reached a point in their human overcoming where no further progress could be made on this level of existence. In fact, they felt that if they remained on Earth for much longer, they would end up regressing in their spiritual development. Over the course of years, decades in some cases, the followers of Heaven's Gate had undergone a radical transformation in the way that they related to themselves, in particular, the way they related to their bodies. They had come to conceptualize bodily death as the forfeiture of something which was not very valuable. By the time they decided to end their lives as a group, the remaining members of Heaven's Gate had already come to view their human bodies as separate from their real selves. To lose their human forms, from their perspective, was to be unburdened, and this was something that had been instilled in them from very early on. From the perspective of the Heaven's Gate believers themselves, the reason they ended their lives when they did was because, in their view, they had completed all of the spiritual work that they could do while living in human form. As far as they were concerned, their mission had come to an end, and it was time for them to move on to the next stage of their evolution. They believed it was time for them to go home. When I look at the lives and deaths of these individuals, I see two things. First, I see a group of people who believed to be true that which they professed to believe. And second, I see a group of people who took a series of actions in light of those same beliefs. I think that these individuals genuinely believed what they claimed to, and I think that the actions they took at the end of their lives are explainable in terms of these beliefs. This view invariably shapes and informs the approach I've taken to analyzing Heaven's Gate for the past year or so. It's why I tend to focus on identifying their most central beliefs and asking questions such as, how do these more basic views inform other beliefs that they hold? How do they inform the practices they follow and the actions they undertook? We certainly don't need to agree with their views or with what they did. But unless we are willing to grant that their belief was genuine, and that their actions were motivated, at least in part, by what they took to be true, then what we are essentially doing is speaking about their own beliefs in our terms, explaining their actions from our perspective, telling their story as though it were ours to tell. That's what we've been largely doing for the last 25 years or so. What I hope to achieve with my own research into this shocking, complicated, and fascinating group of people is pretty simple. I want to listen to what those who have tried to follow these unorthodox teachings have to say about themselves. This is, in my opinion, the best approach to take, since it allows readers, viewers, and listeners of Heaven's Gate research to come to their own conclusions. I want to spark a new conversation about this group. Not a conversation that will come to replace previous attempts to make sense of them, but a conversation that we can have alongside the hard work of other researchers who have been studying Heaven's Gate for many years. Not a conversation that attempts to justify what they did, but a conversation that listens to what they have to say about what they believed and why they believed it. The story of Heaven's Gate is still being written today. It's being written by former members of the group who continue to espouse belief in their teachings. It's being written by contemporary followers of this religion, individuals who have only recently converted to the Heaven's Gate belief system. If we want to understand why someone would be attracted to such an unconventional religious movement, especially after all we know about them now, it seems like a good first step is to listen to them. And so there is a lot more work to be done, and the search will continue. But until next time, thanks for listening.